The sun was slowly sinking behind the wide desert hills, painting the sky in soft colors of orange, pink, and gold. The land stretched far and wide, quiet except for the gentle sound of the wind moving through the tall grass. A group of small wooden houses stood on one side of the river, and on the other side a line of old trees guarded a small Apache village. It was the end of a warm summer day, and the earth still held the heat of the sun. Crickets had begun their soft songs, and the sky was turning a deep blue, like a blanket being pulled across the world. Nalan walked barefoot along a narrow path that led from the river to her home. She was a young Apache girl with long, dark hair that reached down to her waist. Her steps were quiet, and the soft ground under her feet felt warm and familiar. She had grown up here, in this land where the wind smelled like dry grass and cedar trees. For her, the desert was not empty. It was alive. Every rock and tree had its own story, passed down by her elders. As she walked, she held a bundle of herbs she had gathered earlier. Her grandmother had taught her how to pick the right ones, how to know which plants healed wounds and which ones were used in prayers. She moved slowly, listening to the sounds of the night. In the distance, she could hear the horses moving inside the corral. A soft breeze touched her face, carrying the scent of dust and sweet sage. Nalan was 16. In her village, girls of her age were often preparing for their future, learning skills from the women, understanding the old stories, and practicing songs for the special ceremonies that connected them to their ancestors. Nalan loved these traditions deeply. She loved sitting around the fire at night, listening to the old people tell stories about brave warriors, clever women, and the spirits of the mountains. But deep inside her, she sometimes felt a quiet question. What was beyond the horizon? What lay on the other side of the desert? She had heard stories about white settlers, strangers who built towns, rode long distances, and carried their world with them. To many in her village, these outsiders were a threat to their land and way of life. But to Nalan, they were also a mystery. She had never spoken to one of them. She had only seen them from far away, their horses, their wagons, their loud laughter in the distance. Sometimes at night she would look up at the stars and imagine what their lives were like. That evening she reached the riverbank. The river wasn't very wide, but it moved with a calm, steady flow. The water shone with the last light of the sun, reflecting the sky like a mirror. She sat down on a smooth stone, letting her feet touch the cool water. The sound of the river always made her feel safe. It was like a friend that had been there forever. On the other side of the river, in the distance, she noticed movement. At first, she thought it might be one of the men from her village returning with a horse. But as her eyes adjusted to the fading light, she saw a figure she did not recognize. It was a man on horseback, tall and lean. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but she could see the shape of his broad shoulders and the way he sat straight and calm on his horse. The animal moved slowly, drinking from the water at the edge of the river. Nalan's heartbeat quickened. Outsiders didn't usually come this close to their village. Her people didn't trust strangers, and strangers rarely trusted them. But this man didn't seem hurried or afraid. He was alone, and his movements were careful, almost respectful, as if he didn't want to disturb the quiet evening. She lowered her head, unsure whether to leave or stay hidden. But something inside her told her to wait. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair across her face. She brushed it aside and tried to see him more clearly. He wore a long brown coat and a hat with a wide brim. His horse was a beautiful chestnut color, its mane shining softly under the fading sun. She could hear the animal drinking, slow and steady. The man dismounted quietly, tying his horse to a nearby tree. He bent down and cupped his hands in the water, drinking like someone who had been traveling for many hours. His movements were strong but gentle. There was something about the way he stood that made Nalan curious. He wasn't loud or rough like the stories she had heard. He seemed tired, maybe even lonely. Nalan didn't speak. She simply watched him from behind the rock. But then something unexpected happened. The man turned his head slightly and noticed her. Their eyes met for the first time across the river. She froze, not sure if she should run, but he didn't reach for a weapon or raise his voice. Instead, he gave a small, quiet nod, the kind a traveler gives when passing a stranger on a long road. It wasn't threatening, it was human. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The sound of the river grew louder, the air heavier. She felt the strange warmth of being seen, not as a nameless Apache girl, but as a person. He didn't speak her language, and she didn't know his. Yet that single nod carried something that needed no words. It said, "I see you. I mean no harm." She slowly rose to her feet. Her heart was beating fast, but not out of fear, more out of surprise. The man stepped back, giving her space, showing he had no reason to hurt her. He glanced up at the sky, then down at the river, and gave another nod as if saying goodbye. He untied his horse, climbed back into the saddle, and began to ride slowly down the trail. Nalin stood there long after he disappeared behind the trees. The sky was now dark and the stars had come out. The cool night wrapped around her like a blanket, but she barely noticed. All she could think about was that stranger, the way his eyes had met hers, calm and clear. She had heard many stories about the world beyond her land, but none of those stories had felt real until this moment. She walked back to her village with quiet steps, the sound of her heartbeat still strong in her chest. Around the campfire, her family sat together, eating supper and laughing softly. She joined them, but her mind was elsewhere. Her grandmother looked at her and asked gently if everything was all right. Nalin nodded and smiled. She didn't tell anyone about the man, not yet. It felt like a small secret between her and the stars. Later that night, lying on her bed made of soft hides, she stared up at the ceiling of the lodge. Outside, the moonlight spilled gently across the village. She could hear the river in the distance, the same river where she had seen him. She thought about the horse, the man's quiet nod, and the way the air had felt so different in that moment. She didn't know who he was or where he came from. Maybe he was just a traveler passing through. Maybe he would never return. But something inside her whispered that this was not the end of their story. Something had changed, not in the world around her, but inside her. Over the next few days, Nalin carried on with her usual life. She helped her mother with the cooking, fetched water, and sat with the other girls to weave baskets. She joined in the songs at night, clapping her hands in rhythm with the drums. But every evening she found herself walking to the river again, pretending it was just to feel the cool water. In truth, she was waiting, not because she expected him to return, but because that quiet moment had planted a hope she could not name. Sometimes, she would sit on the rock and close her eyes, remembering his face, the soft sound of his horse, and the way the wind had wrapped around them like a thin thread connecting two very different worlds. Meanwhile, far away on the trail, the man, Jacob, rode toward the small town that lay beyond the hills. He too was thinking about the girl by the river. He had seen many faces on his long journeys, but something about her calm eyes stayed with him. There was no anger in them, no fear, just quiet strength. For a man who had spent most of his life alone, the memory felt strangely warm. Neither of them knew how their paths would cross again, but both of them felt it, the quiet pull of fate, like a soft wind guiding two travelers toward the same destination. And so, as summer evenings came and went, the river kept flowing, the stars kept shining, and two lives, one Apache girl and one wandering cowboy, began to slowly, gently weave into the same story. Days passed and summer continued to warm the land. The river still sang its quiet songs and the stars still painted the night sky. Nalin moved through her daily life just as before, helping her family, laughing with her friends, and walking along the familiar paths of the village. But something had changed inside her. Each time she stood by the water's edge, she remembered the man on horseback, the stranger whose eyes had met hers in the fading light. She didn't know his name, but she remembered everything about that moment. The soft breeze, the sound of the water, and the quiet nod that had carried no threat, only a gentle greeting. It was a small memory, but it grew in her heart like a seed slowly taking root. Every evening when the chores were done, Nalin found herself walking back to the river. She told no one why. She just said she liked the sound of the water. Her grandmother watched her carefully, for elders notice everything. Sometimes her grandmother smiled, as if she understood something Nalin herself could not put into words. One evening, as the sun lowered itself over the desert again, she saw something familiar on the other side of the river. A horse, a rider. It was him, the same man. He rode more slowly this time, as if he too was not surprised to find her there. When their eyes met, the soft wind returned, wrapping around them like an old friend. Nalin felt her heart race, but she stayed where she was. She didn't hide behind the rocks this time. She stood straight, her long hair falling over her shoulders, the river between them. The man stopped his horse and took off his hat, holding it against his chest for a moment. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a quiet hello. He didn't cross the river, and neither did she. They only stood there facing each other. He raised his hand in a slow wave, and she hesitated before raising hers too. The smile on his face was small and tired, but kind. Nalan had never felt anything like this before. Two people from such different worlds sharing silence that somehow felt full of meaning. For the next few weeks, they met at the river almost every evening. They never spoke in words because their languages were not the same. Instead, they spoke with small gestures. He sometimes brought her little things, a feather he had found on the trail, a piece of polished stone, or a carved piece of wood. He never threw them at her or forced anything on her. He would simply leave them on a flat rock and step back, giving her the choice to come forward or not. Nalan, at first shy, would wait. Then she would walk slowly, pick up the object and hold it in her hands. Sometimes she would smile. Sometimes she would just look at him with curious eyes. She began to bring small gifts too. A flower from the meadow, a smooth shell from the river, a bead from her hair. She placed them on the same rock, and he accepted them with a soft nod. In this way, an invisible bridge began to form between them. But not everyone in their world would have understood. Nalan knew this. Her people had many reasons to be careful. The land they loved was changing. Strangers had built towns, railroads, and trading posts. New faces arrived almost every month. The elders often spoke around the fire about how they had to protect their ways. In the evenings, when the men returned from hunting, she heard them speak about the settlers. Some said the newcomers only wanted to live peacefully. Others said they took too much and offered too little. Her grandmother often said, "The wind brings both good and trouble. We must listen carefully." Nalan listened. She understood that the man at the river belonged to a world her people did not trust. Yet when she saw him, she didn't see a threat. She saw a traveler who carried silence instead of weapons. Jacob the cowboy had his own thoughts too. He worked at a small ranch far beyond the hills. He didn't have a family anymore, only a horse and a quiet heart. He had traveled through towns where people shouted more than they listened. He had lived through long, hard years, and he had learned to keep his words few. When he first saw Nalan, he had been tired. But something about her calm eyes had stayed with him. He didn't know her language either, but when he came back to the river, he felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. He had grown used to sleeping alone near campfires, used to the restless silence of the night. But here, with the sound of the water and the soft presence of the girl on the other side, that silence felt different. It felt less empty. Even though neither of them spoke out loud, they began to learn each other's ways. She showed him through small signs how to listen to the wind and the river. He showed her how to tie knots and carve little shapes out of wood. Sometimes, when she laughed softly at his clumsy attempts to mimic her gestures, his heart felt lighter. But as their quiet bond grew, the world around them began to shift like sand underfoot. One night, Nalan returned home later than usual. Her older brother, who had always been protective, noticed. He didn't ask where she had been, but his eyes held questions. In their village, trust was strong, but privacy was rare. The next day, a friend of her brother followed her quietly and saw her near the river, standing alone on the rocks. Though he didn't see Jacob clearly, the sight was enough to stir whispers. Whispers in a small village are like leaves in the wind. They move quickly. The elders began to watch Nalan more closely. They did not accuse her of anything, but they were careful. Her grandmother, however, said nothing. She only looked at Nalan with a gaze that carried both wisdom and love. The old woman had seen many seasons pass. She knew the world was not made only of rules. It was made of hearts that often walked their own quiet paths. On the other side of the land, Jacob also felt the change. Some of the men he worked with began to notice he disappeared in the evenings. They teased him, asking if he had found a hidden gold mine. Jacob never answered. He kept his thoughts to himself, but he knew that in their world, people didn't always look kindly at those who crossed lines between communities. Despite the whispers, both Nalan and Jacob returned to the river. It became their meeting place on a space where no one else's words could reach them. One evening, the air felt heavier than usual. Dark clouds were gathering far away, and the wind carried a different kind of silence. When Jacob arrived, he seemed thoughtful. He held a small book in his hands and something precious to him. He opened it slowly, showing Nalan a drawing inside. It was a sketch of the river, the trees, and a small figure on one side. He had drawn her. Not with great skill, but with care. Nolan's eyes widened slightly, not out of fear but out of surprise. She stepped closer, just enough to see the lines more clearly. Jacob didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She understood. He had remembered their place, their quiet moments. She bent down and picked a small stone, flat and round, from the riverbank. She held it tightly in her hand, feeling its weight. Then she crossed the shallowest part of the river, just a few steps, her feet touching the cool water. It was the first time she had ever stepped closer to him. Jacob didn't move toward her. He stayed still, as if afraid a single wrong movement would break the fragile trust between them. Nolan placed the stone on the same flat rock where they always left their gifts. She didn't speak, but the gesture was clear. It was her way of saying, "I trust this moment too." The wind rustled through the trees above them. The first drops of rain began to fall, cool and soft. They stood there for a long moment, both silent, both understanding something unspoken. The storm didn't frighten them. It felt almost like a blessing from the sky, a quiet promise that their meeting was real. When Nolan returned to her village that night, her grandmother was waiting by the fire. The old woman didn't scold her or question her. She simply handed her a warm blanket and said, "The river listens to all who stand beside it." Nolan lowered her eyes and smiled quietly. She lay awake for hours after everyone had gone to sleep, listening to the rain outside. She thought about Jacob's quiet smile, the drawing in his hands, and the way the river had seemed to carry their secrets. She didn't know what the future would bring. She only knew that something gentle and real was growing, like wild flowers that bloom where no one expects them to. Jacob, too, lay awake in his small cabin at the ranch. The rain tapped softly on the roof and he stared at the ceiling. For the first time in a long while, he felt that his lonely road might lead somewhere warm. Both of them, though far apart, fell asleep to the sound of the same rain, dreaming of the same river that had quietly tied their worlds together. The warm days slowly turned into cooler nights. The desert wind carried a softer chill, and the leaves on the old cottonwood trees near the river began to rustle in a different way. Every evening the sky turned a deep gold before fading to violet, and every evening Nolan found herself walking to the same place. The river had become more than just water flowing through the land. It had become the quiet line that connected two souls from two different worlds. Jacob now arrived almost at the same time each night. Sometimes he came on horseback, the sound of hooves soft against the sand. Other times he came on foot, leading his horse slowly, as if not wanting to disturb the night. Nolan no longer waited hidden behind rocks. She stood openly now, with the river between them, her long dark hair moving gently in the wind. They had learned to talk with their eyes, their hands, and small gestures. She taught him how to point to the stars and name them in her language. He would smile, repeat the words softly, and she would laugh at his strange accent. In return, he showed her how to draw letters in the dirt, slowly shaping her name in English. She couldn't read it fully, but she liked the way it looked. It felt like a secret code between them. Each evening felt like a quiet promise. Yet beneath this calm surface, both of them felt something slowly building, something stronger than just curiosity. It was the feeling of being seen, understood, even when no words were spoken. One night, the air was warmer than usual. The sky was full of stars, scattered like silver dust. The moon shone bright, covering everything in soft light. Nolan walked to the river with quiet steps. She could hear the frogs singing near the water and the distant sound of a coyote calling out from the hills. The world felt calm, as if it were holding its breath. Jacob was already there, standing by his horse. He had taken off his hat and placed it on the saddle. His face, usually hidden in shadows, was clear under the moonlight. His eyes carried the tiredness of a man who had traveled a long road, but they also held something softer when he looked at her. For a long moment, they said nothing. They simply stood facing each other across the river. The night wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Then Nolan took a slow step closer to the water and he mirrored her on the other side. The distance between them felt smaller than ever. Jacob reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it slowly and held it up. It was a small necklace made of leather with a smooth stone in the center. The stone was shaped like a teardrop and polished until it shined softly in the moonlight. Nolan's eyes widened. She had seen necklaces like this in town once, hanging in the windows of traders. They were not ordinary objects. They were special. Jacob didn't cross the river. Instead, he bent down and placed the necklace gently on the flat rock where they always exchanged their gifts. Then he stepped back, giving her space just like he always did. Nalin walked slowly forward, her heart beating fast. She picked up the necklace, feeling the smooth surface of the stone. For a moment, she simply held it against her chest, as if it were the most precious thing she had ever touched. Jacob's eyes followed her every movement. He didn't speak, but she could feel the weight of his silence. It wasn't a heavy silence. It was warm, honest, and full of feeling. Nalin looked at him and then at the necklace again. She understood what he was trying to say without words. In their different worlds, they didn't speak the same language, but they understood kindness and care. That night, under the stars, she realized that what had started as a quiet friendship had grown into something far deeper. Her heart felt light and heavy all at once. She stepped closer to the water, letting her feet touch the cool river. The sound of the water around her ankles seemed louder than the world itself. She looked up at Jacob, her eyes calm but glowing with quiet emotion. And then, in a voice softer than the wind, she spoke. It was the first time she had ever spoken to him. Her voice trembled slightly, not because of fear, but because of the weight of the moment. She whispered, "If I please you tonight, will you keep me forever?" The words were simple, but they carried more than their sound. To Nalin, it wasn't about ownership. It was about trust. It was her way of asking if their quiet connection was something real, something that would last beyond the river, beyond the nights, beyond the distance between their two worlds. It was a question wrapped in hope and a little bit of fear. Jacob didn't fully understand her words, but he heard her voice. He heard the way her heart spoke through it. He didn't move toward her suddenly or speak loudly. Instead, he took a slow step forward. His eyes softened and a quiet smile spread on his face. He placed his hand over his heart, then reached it toward her, a gesture that said, "I hear you. I will not forget this." For a long moment, the night stood still. The river flowed gently between them, the moonlight shining down like a gentle hand. A warm breeze passed, lifting a strand of Nalin's hair across her cheek. Jacob's heart ached in a way he didn't fully understand. He had been alone for so long, moving from town to town, never truly belonging anywhere. But here, under the silver sky, with this girl whose language he could not speak, he felt something close to belonging. Nalin stepped back from the river slowly. She held the necklace close, feeling its weight against her palm. She didn't need a big promise. All she needed was that moment, the quiet, gentle understanding between two people who came from different paths, yet stood in the same place. But the world outside their secret river was not quiet forever. That night, as she returned to her village, the air felt heavier. One of the older women, who had seen her walking toward the river more than once, spoke softly to another. Whispers spread again like dry leaves in the wind. Nalin didn't hear them yet, but the world around her had begun to stir. Jacob, too, felt something shift. When he returned to the small ranch, one of the men he worked with asked where he had been going every night. It was a harmless question, said with a half smile, but Jacob felt a weight behind it. People in town had their own ideas, their own rules. They didn't always look kindly at what they didn't understand. The bond between Nalin and Jacob was like a fragile bird, beautiful but easy to disturb. Still, neither of them spoke about the growing whispers. They returned to the river the next night as if nothing had changed. They looked at each other the way they always had, quietly, gently, without fear. But something inside Nalin was changing. For the first time in her young life, she wanted something that was not decided by her village or her elders. She wanted to choose her own path. And though she didn't know what the future would bring, she knew Jacob was a part of it. She had never spoken many words to him, but in her heart she had said more than she had ever said to anyone. Jacob also carried her words with him like a secret flame. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew this river, this girl, and this feeling were the first real things he had found in a long time. Their worlds were still far apart. There were traditions, expectations, and old fears waiting for them outside of their secret place. But for now, under the soft stars and whispering water, they had built something their own hearts understood. As Nalin lay in her bed that night, the necklace resting close to her heart, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the night sounds. She thought about the way Jacob had looked at her, the warmth in his smile, the quiet in his eyes. It made her feel safe, not because he promised her anything grand, but because he had listened, truly listened. And somewhere beyond the hills, Jacob also lay awake thinking about her voice, soft like the wind, steady like the river. He had spent many years chasing things that faded with time. But this feeling, felt like something that could stay. Neither of them said it out loud, but both of them knew. Something had begun that neither distance nor silence could easily erase. The river had heard her whisper, the stars had seen their eyes meet, and the wind had carried the promise into the night. The world around them might change, people might speak, time might pass. But the memory of that night, of her soft voice and his quiet answer, would live in their hearts like the steady song of the river, flowing even when unseen. The days that followed the moonlit night at the river carried a quiet kind of weight. Something had changed between Nalin and Jacob. It wasn't something loud or visible. It lived in the air around them, in the way they looked at each other, in the way the river seemed to flow slower when they met. Nalin wore the leather necklace with the smooth stone around her neck every day. Hidden under her clothes where no one else could see, it was her silent promise to herself, a reminder of the night she had whispered her heart's question. She still went about her daily tasks in the village, fetching water, helping her grandmother prepare herbs and listening to the stories told around the evening fire, but her mind often wandered to the river and to him. Every small sound outside at dusk made her heart beat faster, as if the night itself was calling her to meet him again. Jacob, too, carried her voice inside him. He kept riding to the river after his day's work at the ranch. Some nights she was already there, waiting quietly like a shadow under the trees. Other nights he would arrive first and sit by the water, watching the stars until her soft steps touched the edge of the sand. But as their bond grew stronger, the world around them grew louder. In the village, whispers about Nalin walking alone at night began to spread more. A few older women talked softly near the fires. Some said she was too curious about things beyond the village. Some said it was just a phase of youth. Her grandmother never spoke against her, but Nalin could feel the watchful eyes. Jacob also began to feel eyes on him. At the ranch, a few men began asking more questions about where he went at night. At first it was teasing. Then it became curious. Jacob was a quiet man, not one to share much about his personal life. But he could feel that their curiosity was not just playful. People liked to make stories where there were none, and sometimes stories could change everything. One evening, Nalin didn't go to the river. She stayed home helping her grandmother. But even as she worked, she felt a pull deep inside her, a pull toward the quiet place by the water where the world seemed smaller and safer. She almost went out late, but something held her back. It was a quiet fear she hadn't felt before. It wasn't fear of Jacob. It was fear of what others might do with their whispers. Jacob waited by the river that night. He sat on a rock and watched the moon's reflection ripple on the water. He held the little sketchbook he carried, the one where he had drawn her standing on the riverbank. He didn't know why, but he felt uneasy. The wind carried no song that night, only silence. The next evening, Nalin returned to the river. Jacob was already there, his face thoughtful but softening the moment he saw her. She walked closer, and when their eyes met, they didn't need to explain their missed night. Silence was enough. They had learned to understand each other in ways beyond words. That night, they didn't exchange gifts. They didn't try to make new promises. They simply sat on opposite sides of the river, close enough to see every small change in each other's faces. The night sky was clear. The air smelled of sage and warm sand. Jacob traced shapes in the dirt with a stick, and Nalin watched the stars above, feeling a strange mix of warmth and worry in her chest. As the days passed, the quiet bond between them became a part of their lives. Nalin began teaching Jacob a few words from her language. She pointed at the stars and said their names, and he repeated them carefully, his voice low and steady. He taught her a few words in English, too, words like river, star, and friend. Every new word felt like a small bridge being built between their two worlds. But they both knew deep inside that their world, beyond the river, was not as gentle as the world they had created by the water. Outside, things were not always kind to stories like theirs. Still, neither of them spoke of it. They just held on to their moments, treating each meeting as if it might be their last. One late afternoon, the sky turned gray, and the wind carried the smell of rain. Nalin left her home early, her heart eager to meet Jacob, The wind pulled at her hair as she walked the familiar path to the river. When she arrived, he was already there, his hat tilted back, his horse resting nearby. He looked up at her with a smile that was both tired and warm, the kind of smile that said, "I was waiting." They stood there quietly for a while, listening to the soft sound of the wind moving through the trees. Jacob took a small folded piece of paper from his pocket and held it up carefully so it wouldn't blow away. On it was a drawing, not of the river this time, but of a small cabin surrounded by trees with smoke curling from a chimney. It was simple but full of meaning. Jacob tapped his chest, then pointed to the drawing, then pointed toward the horizon. Nalin understood. He was showing her a dream, a place where life was quiet, where the world wasn't divided by lines and whispers. A place where they could just be two people, not two sides of a story others had written for them. Nalin looked down at the necklace around her neck and touched the smooth stone. She didn't speak, but she stepped forward and touched the drawing lightly, right at the center of the cabin. Then she placed her hand over her heart. Jacob understood her answer without a single word. That night, rain began to fall gently. They stayed by the river a little longer, even as the drops touched their faces and soaked their clothes. Neither of them cared about the rain. It felt soft, like the world was blessing their small, quiet dream. But dreams do not float outside the world forever. In the following days, the whispers in both their communities grew stronger. Nalin's older brother noticed the way she wore the necklace and how her eyes often looked toward the horizon. Though he didn't speak of it, he watched closely. Jacob's co-workers began to guess that his quiet rides had a purpose. Nalin felt the change even in the air. Her grandmother spoke to her one evening in a gentle voice. "The wind listens, child. And when the wind listens too long, others hear too." Nalin didn't answer, but she held her grandmother's hands tightly. The old woman's eyes were kind but serious. She understood that love could be beautiful, but it also came with paths that were not easy to walk. Jacob noticed changes too. A few men at the ranch had begun asking direct questions. He gave no answers, but he could feel how eyes followed him now. It was as if their quiet story had started to travel through the air, even though neither of them had spoken of it. Despite this, they did not stop meeting at the river. If anything, their moments together became softer and more careful. They spoke less, but every glance and gesture carried more meaning. They spent more time listening to the wind, as if both understood that the world might not give them this quiet for much longer. One night, Nalin brought a small woven band she had made with her own hands. It was made of soft threads dyed in the colors of the sunset, red, gold, and brown. She tied it gently around Jacob's wrist. He looked at it and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. He didn't need to ask what it meant. He knew. It was her way of saying, "I believe in this." In return, Jacob took off one of the buttons from his old jacket. Not much, but it was something he had worn for years, through every road he had traveled. He placed it in her hand with care. She closed her fingers around it, feeling the roughness of the old fabric. It wasn't gold or silver, but to her, it was more precious than any jewel. The rain came again that night, soft and quiet, as they sat near the river. The world around them was changing, and they could feel it. But here, for a few hours, the river still belonged to them. The stars still shone above them. The wind still wrapped their secret like a gentle thread. They didn't make big promises or speak of forever. They didn't need to. Their silence was strong enough to hold what words couldn't. Each meeting, each touch of the wind, each glance across the river had become their quiet story, one they carried in their hearts even when the world outside grew louder. And though neither of them knew what tomorrow would bring, they held on to that night and the sound of rain falling on the river, because in that moment, their story felt bigger than the whispers, bigger than the distance, bigger than the world that tried to keep them apart. The river, which had first connected them, now carried their secret like a gentle song, and though storms might rise and winds might shift, the river would always remember their quiet bond. The days grew shorter and the air became cooler. Autumn had slowly wrapped itself around the desert like a quiet blanket. The golden grass near the river turned a soft shade of brown, and the nights became crisp. The river still flowed gently, but its sound carried something different now. A little heavier, as if even the water knew that change was coming. Nalin stood outside her family's home one early evening, feeling the wind brush against her cheeks. The sky was painted with shades of gold and pink as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. She wore the same leather necklace Jacob had given her, the smooth stone resting close to her heart. It had become more than just a gift. It was a part of her, like a quiet promise she carried each day. For many weeks now, the river had been their secret world, but whispers in both of their communities had grown louder, even though neither of them spoke of their meetings. Nalan's brother had started to watch her carefully. The men at Jacob's ranch spoke more openly about him riding out at night. The wind had carried their story beyond their hearts, and both could feel the change in the air even if no one had said it aloud. That evening, when Nalan reached the river, Jacob was already there. His hat rested on his horse and his hair was a little messier than usual, blown by the wind. When she saw his face, her heart felt a small ache, not of pain but of something quiet and real. She walked slowly, her steps soft, until she stood on the opposite side of the river. Jacob didn't smile right away. His eyes were thoughtful, as if he carried something heavy inside. But when their eyes met, the world seemed to soften around them, just like it always did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The river moved between them, calm and gentle, just like the first day they met. Finally, Jacob reached into his pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. His hands moved carefully, as if the paper held something fragile. He unfolded it and held it up. On the paper was another drawing. This time it wasn't a cabin or the river. It was a map, a simple sketch of the land showing a trail that led away from the town, away from everything. Nalan's breath caught in her chest. She understood what he was trying to say. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a choice. Jacob was asking her if she would leave everything behind and walk with him toward a different kind of life. A life not shaped by other people's whispers. A life where the river wasn't the only place they could meet. The wind rustled softly through the trees. The sky had grown deeper in color, and the first star appeared above them. Nalan held the necklace in her hand for a moment, feeling the smooth surface of the stone. She looked at Jacob, at the way his eyes held both hope and worry. This was not an easy question. It was bigger than anything she had ever faced before. In her village, her life had been simple and steady. She knew every path, every tree, every sound the wind made at night. She had grown up here, listening to the stories of her people, learning their ways. She loved her family, her grandmother, the firelight, and the songs. But she also loved the river, and Jacob, and the quiet way their souls spoke to each other without needing words. She stepped forward, letting the tips of her feet touch the edge of the river. The water was cool, sliding gently over her skin. She looked down at the reflection of the stars, then back up at him. His hand trembled just slightly as he held the map, though his face stayed calm. He wasn't trying to take her from her world. He was offering her a place beside him if she wanted it. Jacob had never felt so unsure in his life. He was a man who had spent years wandering from place to place, never truly belonging anywhere. He had not expected to meet someone like Nalan, someone who made the world quieter just by being near. But now, standing under the soft light of the stars, he realized that no road he'd ever taken had felt more important than the one in front of him right now. Her answer, whatever it would be, would shape his future in ways he had never imagined. Nalan knelt by the river and touched the surface with her fingertips. She remembered every moment they had shared. The first time their eyes met, the small gifts on the rock, the first soft words she had whispered, the way the wind always seemed to sing when they were together. Those moments were like stones placed carefully inside her heart, building something strong and gentle. She thought of her grandmother, whose kind eyes had always watched her with quiet understanding. She thought of the songs around the fire and the soft nights filled with laughter. But she also thought of the way she felt whenever she was with Jacob, free, alive, and seen in a way she had never experienced before. The night wrapped around them softly, waiting. Jacob slowly lowered the map and stepped closer to the riverbank, though still on his side. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. He didn't say much, just her name. It was the first time he had said it out loud. He had practiced it many times alone, learning the sound of it. Now, as he said it, the sound fell softly into the night like a promise. Nalan's heart stirred. Hearing her name in his voice felt like a gentle touch. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush against her face. She opened them again and met his eyes. She didn't speak many words in English, but she knew the few he had taught her. She pointed toward the map and whispered softly, "Dream." Jacob's breath caught. The word was small, but its meaning was large. She didn't say yes or no, but in that single word she told him she understood. She told him she saw what he saw. A quiet smile spread across his face, the kind that carried both joy and sadness. He knew she had not given an answer yet, but she had not turned away either. The stars grew brighter and the moon climbed higher. They stood there for a long time, the river flowing gently between them. Jacob folded the map and tucked it safely into his jacket. He didn't need her to choose that night. Love was not something to be rushed like a fast river. It was something that moved at its own pace, like water finding its way through rocks. In the days that followed, they continued to meet. The world around them did not grow quieter, but they learned to hold their moments like treasures. Sometimes they spoke in their few shared words. Sometimes they said nothing at all. But each meeting felt more precious, as if the wind itself carried their story. Nalin didn't tell anyone about the map, but her grandmother noticed a deeper light in her eyes. One night, while the fire burned low, her grandmother sat beside her and placed a hand over Nalin's heart. She didn't ask questions. She just whispered softly, "When you follow your heart, make sure you can still hear your own song." Jacob, too, began to prepare quietly. He fixed his horse's saddle, checked the old trail, and folded the map many times. He didn't know where life would take them, but he knew that his heart would no longer travel alone. Then came the night when the wind felt different. It was cool, calm, and full of stars. The river shimmered under the moonlight like silver silk. Nalin arrived at the river wearing a light shawl around her shoulders, the necklace shining softly beneath. Jacob stood waiting, his face lit by the moon. He held no paper this time, no new drawing, no gift, just his quiet presence. They walked slowly toward the same flat rock where they had first left their gifts long ago. Nalin placed a small wildflower on it. Jacob placed his hand on his heart and then over the rock. It was their way of saying, "Whatever happens, this story will live here." Nalin then reached into her shawl and pulled out a small woven pouch. She held it out with both hands. Inside were a few beads, a tiny shell from the river, and a single feather. Jacob understood immediately, and these were pieces of their time together. She was giving him a part of her world. Jacob closed his hands gently around the pouch. He didn't need to speak. His eyes said everything. He wanted her to come with him, but he would not hold her like something to be taken. He would hold her like something to be honored. Nalin stepped back, letting the night fill the silence. She looked up at the stars, then at him, and whispered one more word, "Remember." He nodded slowly, the light of the moon catching the quiet curve of his smile. He would remember, always. The wind picked up, brushing softly against the trees. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the river, the stars, and the quiet thread that tied their hearts together. They both knew the road ahead would not be simple. But some stories are not written in grand places. Some stories live quietly, in the sound of water, the touch of wind, and the memory of two souls who met beneath the stars. Jacob touched the pouch she had given him, and Nalin touched the necklace around her neck. Their gifts had become their silent promise that even if the world changed, even if the river ran in new directions, the memory of their quiet love would never disappear. And as they walked away from the river that night, each toward their own world, the stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they too carried the echo of their gentle story. Some say that years later, travelers near the river could still feel a soft wind moving through the trees on quiet nights. Some say it carried a whisper, not of sadness, not of loss, but of a love that lived gently like water, quiet, endless, and unforgettable.